No, you can leave it on. All right.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm going to make a start, and we can have some latecomers come in as I'm speaking. My name's Shannon Creaney. I'm the Victorian Birds on Farms Monitoring Coordinator and the Interim WA Coordinator. So hello, if you're joining us from the West, welcome. I would like to begin this evening's event by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which I am calling in from today. That's the Wadawurrung people. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from where you might be calling in today. I wish to pay my respects to elders of past, present and emerging and acknowledge that sovereignty has not been ceded. Thank you. So welcome everybody to our second Your Birds on Farms webinar. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. If you were with us in our last webinar, we focused on all things on the current state and future of birds on farms. So basically getting everyone up to speed with what the project currently looks like and what our future goals are and some of our achievements. And if you didn't have the chance to watch it, it is now up on our Birds on Farms YouTube channel, so make sure you have a look. Now, some quick housekeeping before I introduce today's guest speaker. Questions, you're welcome to ask questions in the Q&A or the chat function. Now, depending on how you logged in today, you might see the Q&A or you might see the chat function. Write your questions in either and we will be moderating that and answering questions, and then we'll have time for more questions at the end. And you will see that your microphones are off for this webinar. Now I will hand it over to our Birds on Farms manager, Margot Oorebeek, to tell you about the 5 key features of a woodland habitat. Thank you, Margot.
All right, thank you very much, Sharon. Shannon, I will just need to share my screen, so bear with me for a moment. And I'll just enlarge that and get it onto presenter mode. There we go. Shannon, can you just tell me if I can, or Scott, whether you can see the screen all right?
Yeah, we can see that perfectly. Thanks, Margot.
All right. Thank you. So yes, welcome everybody. I'm joining you tonight from lovely Ngunnawal country. It is currently descending to -2 degrees overnight. So I hope everybody is keeping warm. And yeah, hopefully this will go off without a hitch. So tonight I'll be talking to you about the 5 key features that make up woodland habitat. And that is really, I guess, the reason why we're talking about this is really because we are talking about a decline in woodland birds that we're seeing at the moment. And we want to do something about that. We want to reverse that and hopefully, get more of the woodland bird community back. So at first, I want to talk to you about why we are creating more habitat. So as you can see, within Australia, we have approximately 750 bird species that are either resident or regular visitors to Australia. Now, of those 750 species, 195 birds are dependent on woodland habitat. Now, this woodland habitat can both be the habitat that's in southeastern Australia, which is more of the boxgum grassy woodland, or this can also include the birds that occur in the northern regions in the savanna woodlands. But in 2020, BirdLife Australia led the creation of the threatened or the Temperate Woodland Bird Conservation Action Plan. And in that action plan, they identified 51 species and subspecies of birds that are now listed as threatened or are in significant decline across Australia. And that is mostly within the southeastern parts of Australia that this is based on. So if you're thinking about it, 51 species out of 195 species that are dependent on woodlands, that means that approximately a quarter of the birds that rely on woodland habitat are in decline. Now, when we're talking about temperate woodlands and the reasons why these birds are in decline, it's because of habitat loss. So over the past, decades, over 70% of temperate woodlands have been lost across Australia. Most of this has occurred in the southeastern parts of Australia, but it also is in the southwest. And the remaining woodland really now is very, very fragmented, and a lot of the woodland only occurs on areas of low quality soils that are really not suitable for agriculture. And that's really the reason why they haven't been cleared in the first place. So it's low quality soil for agriculture, but it also means that it's low quality soil for woodlands. So really those birds that we now have left are living in fragmented landscape and in low quality landscapes. Now, one of the reasons we've started the Birds on Farms project is because 75% of the remaining woodland can be found on private property. So that's quite a lot. And we really want to work with landholders in those rural areas to try and preserve that woodland and hopefully, restore it and improve the quality of what's left on private properties. And in that respect, hopefully reverse the decline of, the woodland bird community. As you know, we go out to people and we talk about, restoring woodland habitat, woodland bird habitat specifically. And the question we often get is, well, what do you mean with woodland bird habitat? It's for us, we talk about it and we think that everybody knows it, but it's not that simple. If you're thinking about all the woodland birds that are out there, from the 195 species, there's a lot of species that have different feeding habits, different breeding habits. And so if you want to cater for all of those, it can be quite overwhelming to think about what woodland bird habitat actually is. So in this case, we want to make it slightly easier. See, there we go. So this webinar is specifically about what makes good quality woodland bird habitat. So what we're aiming for is we want to bring back the woodlands that used to occur here. And those were the intact, mature woodland ecosystems. So as you can see in the picture above, this is what we currently have on a lot of agricultural land and in a lot of rural areas. It is sort of, isolated paddock trees or a few mature trees that are still standing, but generally above just the grassy ecosystem. What we want to return it to is the picture below, where you can see that there's far more diversity. There's trees of different ages, there's multiple species present, and that's what we want to return it to. And if you're looking at that picture, you might still think this is very, very complex. But realistically, we can break it down into 5 easy steps. So if you want to create good woodland bird habitat, you need to think of 5 things. The first one is structural diversity. The second one we need to consider is species diversity, then shrubs, connectivity, and the 5th one is waterways and dams. Now, I'll talk about all of those in a little bit more detail. So when we're talking about structural diversity, what are we thinking of? Well, like we showed in the first picture, we're thinking of something more than just a number of trees over a grassy area. We're talking about trees of different shapes, sizes, diversity. So what we really want is we want to create that woodland habitat. Now, there's several different types of woodland habitat across Australia, depending on where you are. But most of them have a very similar sort of structure to them. So a lot of them will have the canopy layer at the top, so the really tall trees. They'll have a mid-story layer, which is consistent of shrubs and young trees that are about 2 to 4 meters tall. Then there's an understory or a shrub layer, which is usually shrubs that come from the ground to about 2 meters tall. And then you've got ground cover plants. So that can be creepers, it can be forbs and herbs, or it can be native grasses. But that sort of makes up the structure of a woodland. And depending on which woodland you're talking about, it might have, fewer shrubs that are occurring in that area and more ground cover, or it has no mid-story at all, but a lot of understory and canopy. So there's a few, regional differences, but in general, that's what we're talking about. And the reason why we need these vegetation layers is because the birds in Australia have really adapted to foraging in certain vegetation layers. So as you can see on the pictures on the screen, when we're talking about the birds that live in the canopy, we quite often think about the honey eaters. This is a brown-headed honey eater. They tend to forage in the canopy, and they tend to forage on both insects as well as nectar that you can find in the flowers of the gum trees. The second bird underneath that, that is the mistletoe bird. And as you can see in the picture, there are some sort of leaves that you can see which are a bit more golden. So that's on the left-hand side of the picture. That's a mistletoe. So the mistletoes tend to occur high in the canopy, but they can even occur quite low to the ground. But mistletoe birds, as the name suggests, are specialized in feeding on mistletoe. So they use that vegetation layer in there. Then we've got babblers. In this case, a white-browed babbler. They really use the shrub layer and the mid-story layer. They're really well adapted to it. They don't really occur in areas where those layers don't exist. And they use it for both hiding from predators. They feed on the shrubs and on the insects that occur through there. But they also build their nests in the shrubs. And these guys, they build communal nests and they go and roost together every night. So they build multiple nests throughout their territory where they can pick and choose. So they need quite a few shrubs to support all those nests. The little guy underneath that, I'm guessing a lot of people might be familiar with, even though it's one of the little brown jobs for the birdwatching world. It's a brown hornbill. And brown hornbill, similar to the babblers, tend to only occur in areas where there's shrub layers. They really like to just feed on that area of about 1 meter to 3 meters high. And then the one on the bottom, it's one of our more unknown species. It's a painted button quill. It's a ground forager, and it doesn't really, other than, running away from predators, it doesn't really fly. So it spends the majority of its time on the ground, and it only occurs in areas where there's shrubs, so it can hide under and behind the shrubs. But it also requires a lot of leaf litter because it will scrape through the leaf litter in search of, insects and seeds and everything else that it can find. So as you can see, to cater for all those species of birds, we really need to have that diversity in structure. So that's quite key. Now, one of the ways that you can create diversity in structure is, of course, by using different species of trees. But other ways you can do it is using plants of different ages. Now, if we're thinking about a eucalypt, and we're picturing, on one hand, we're picturing a eucalypt that is maybe 10 years old. So we're picturing a eucalypt that reaches about 5 meters tall. Then we're thinking about another eucalypt that is 150 years old. And if you're thinking about that one, you immediately think of this really big tree that is, 25 meters tall, really big spreading canopy, and a big trunk on it. So if you're thinking about what I've just talked about, the small young tree really forms part of that mid-story. And even throughout its life, it will grow, and it will come from what was originally sort of understory, it will grow through the mid-story, and then will become a canopy tree. So while it's young, it provides the same function as a mid-story tree. And when it gets older, it creates a function that only old trees can have. So old trees are the only ones that will be old enough to create hollows. They will have a lot of bark on the trunks. They'll create a lot of leaf litter, and it will also create a lot of fallen debris. So we're thinking about fallen branches and sometimes, half a trunk that falls off. So there's a lot of coarse woody debris under those trees. Now, those are features to a woodland that only old trees can provide. And that's why it's so immensely important to protect when we have them on the property. So we're thinking that, yes, structural diversity can be created by different species, but we also need to take into account that there's different ages that can create structural diversity. Now, when we're talking about structural diversity, and I said, old trees create something that you can't really bring back into the landscape. There are some ways of trying to recreate this. So we're talking about the coarse woody debris. Those were the stems and the trunks, the branches that have fallen off. That coarse woody debris is really quite important for a lot of bird species. So there are species like scarlet robins, and other robins as well, that use that coarse woody debris to perch on. And they'll sit on the little perch. It's about, 50 centimeters to a meter off the ground. And they'll start looking around. And from there, they can scout out the ground and see if there's insect running around. When they see an insect, they can immediately pounce on it. And they go back to their little perch where they can start scanning for the next meal. Now, they use that both for scanning for their meals, but they will also use it to scan for, birds of prey that are coming around or other predators that might be approaching. So it's a really good perch as a lookout for food as well as for predators. So that's one way that birds are using coarse woody debris. The other way they're using it is because coarse woody debris is, in the process of disintegrating and basically returning back to its origins. And that's helped along by a lot of invertebrates and fungi that are breaking down the wood. And those invertebrates are, of course, food for a lot of other birds. So there's, for example, brown tree creepers that forage a lot on this coarse woody debris. Again, the scarlet robins will feed around it. But you will also have the birds that are foraging on the ground that can use these insects that are sort of spread around those logs. So as I said, this is really important, but it is sort of habitat we can recreate. So if you have on the property, if you have, branches that have fallen down, but they're in the way because they're either lying in a paddock, over a road, over your fence, the best thing is to take it away and put it somewhere else in your property, especially if you have a revegetation area. You can put it there and then the birds can use it, but it's out of your way. Plus, you can fix your fence, which is now ready to be fixed. So there are ways of recreating this. The original is always best, but it's definitely a good step forward. The other really important component to structural diversity is mistletoe. Like a lot of people don't like mistletoe because they think that it's a parasite and, it's not good for the trees. But mistletoes in Australia are actually, while they are parasites, they are all native parasites. So they are all native to Australia. As a parasite, they don't try to wipe out their host tree. They actually try to coexist with them. So if you have healthy trees, they can actually support quite a few mistletoes that are growing on them. So it's not really an issue you need to immediately be concerned about. It's more trees that are already in a poor state. Especially isolated paddock trees, which are in areas where they're pounded by the wind. The soil's being compacted around them by livestock. Potentially, they've got a lot of nutrients that are coming into their root system, which they can't quite deal with because of all the livestock around it. So those trees that are in slightly worse condition, they might suffer from a mistletoe infestation. But if you just have healthy trees in a wooded landscape, they're really not an issue to have mistletoe on them. So why do we say, mistletoe is an important structural component? It's because mistletoe, because they're a parasite, they take their water and nutrients from the tree host they grow on, which means that they aren't reliant on water if they flower. So they can flower any time of the year because they can extract the water that they require for their flowering from the tree. So it gives them the ability to flower in very different times than other trees do around them. So if there is a drought, mistletoes can actually still flower. And this makes them very important food sources for birds, especially for birds that are relying on nectar, but also birds that are relying on insects because the insects will just as much be attracted to the flowering of the mistletoe. Now, the second reason why the mistletoe is really important is because their leaves are highly nutritious. If you're thinking about eucalypt and you're thinking about, the folding leaves of a eucalypt, what a eucalypt does before it drops its leaf is it extracts all the nutrients and it takes back all the water. So when the leaf falls, it's pretty much just a dried up, crispy bit that falls to the ground. It's not a lot of nutrients that sit in that. So the soil doesn't really benefit that much from that leaf litter. If a mistletoe drops its leaf, it does it, but it doesn't extract the nutrients and it doesn't extract the water content of the leaf. So it just drops it as is, which means that when it drops to the ground, it actually is full of nutrients. And when it starts composting, all those nutrients are released. So there's a lot of insect life that will be living underneath the mistletoes. And there's a lot, it's also very good for the trees. But those insects attract birds again, and especially a lot of the birds that are living on the ground and feeding on the ground. So surprisingly, if you have mistletoes high up in the trees, it's actually really good for ground foraging birds. So that's something to take into consideration. And like all plants, you can actually plant mistletoe if you don't have it on your property. And then the last part of the structural diversity that I want to talk about is tree hollows. So as I mentioned before, tree hollows only exist in very old trees. It takes about 100 years before a tree starts developing a hollow. Quite often it starts off with a tiny little hollow, but those can be suitable for birds like pardalotes. They only require a very small one. But as the tree grows bigger, the hollows can also increase. So if we're talking about hollows like the hollow for this Carnaby's cockatoo on the right, that can be a tree that's about 200 years old before it has the ability to develop that sized hollow. So it's really important that if we do have trees with hollows like that, whether they are living trees or whether they're dead trees, to make sure we keep that tree and we protect that hollow as much as possible. So there's quite a lot of, woodland birds that are relying on hollows for roosting and nesting. And if we don't have these hollows in our area, so if you've done revegetation and your revegetation is less than 100 years old, which in most cases it is, you won't have those hollows in your revegetation site yet. So what we can do is we can create artificial hollows and hang them up. We're mostly talking about nest boxes in this context. And I know I can hear a lot of you thinking already, nest boxes aren't always successful. We've heard some stories about bad ones. We've heard some really good stories. The black cockatoo nest box here in the picture, that's actually been very successful design for the Carnaby's and the Baudin's black cockatoos in WA. So that's like one of the success stories. But we've also all heard about, nest boxes that we hang up and the only thing that comes into it is honeybees. So really to increase the effectiveness of a nest box, what we need to do is you need to have a look at what species are occurring on your property. So first find out what species actually lives there, because putting a nest box up for a species that doesn't live in your area is highly unlikely to be successful because that species can't smell that there's all of a sudden a nest box there. So it's always better to work with the species that are in your area. From that one, you can have a look and see, okay, which one are using hollows and which one could we potentially create a nest box for. And then once you have a look at it, you need to make sure that you're using a species-specific nest box. So if you're going on to their website, Nest Box Tales, they actually have a lot of designs specific for certain species of woodland birds. So that really increases the likelihood of one of these species using your nest box and the nest box actually being successful. So yeah, something to think about when you're thinking about nest boxes. The second sort of component when we're talking about this is species diversity. That's really important for creating good woodland habitat. So when we're thinking about species diversity, quite often we're thinking, the first thing when we're thinking about creating woodlands is putting trees back in the landscape, which is fantastic. But if you're putting trees back, make sure you put a variety of species of trees back. So not just yellow box, but do yellow box and gray box and red gum that all, of course, are native to your area. But put a selection in because these species all flower at different times. And if all these species flower at different times, it means there's a food source in that area for a longer period, which means that birds are able to use that area for longer periods at a time. And there's just more food security for them. So it's not just, of course, trees, but it's also all the shrubs. And you just need to find this really nice combination and diversity of species. Also, not all flowering trees cater for birds. So you will have a lot of species, let's say acacias, quite often they cater for insects. So they really rely on the insects to pollinate them. But of course, insects, once again, are food for birds. So if you bring in, trees that produce flowers that are useful for birds. You have plants that produce flowers that are useful for insects. You're already starting to cater for a really wide diversity of bird species. And again, birds not just forage on flowers and on insects, but they also eat seeds and fruits and other parts of the plant. So, for example, the superb parrot that you can see in the picture on the right, they love seeds of hop bushes. They like seeds of acacias. So it's really important to, have a look around and just go like, okay, well, these produce a lot of seeds, so I can put a seed producing plant in, and I can put some plants in that are great for insects. I can put a couple of plants in that are great for birds. And it really, you can create this diversity, which means you're creating a little smorgasbord for birds where they can feed and they can choose from. So that's really important. And then the other thing is trees and plants all have different structures. So as I said, you can create structural diversity by using different age trees. But you can also create structural diversity by using, picking a diversity of trees that you're putting back on your property. Trees can be tall, trees can be short, trees can have long ribbons of bark hanging off it. Other trees have really smooth bark. You can have bushes which are really dense or ones that are really spiky. All of those have attributes that species will use. The little ones with the stringy bark, eastern shrike-tits, will feed on those by pulling down the bark and feeding on the insects underneath it. If you have spiky bushes, little birds like brown hornbills can build their nest in it and feel really safe and be protected from predators. So there's just, a really nice diversity of species is what's required for this. So that was step number 2. I do actually have to put a little reminder in this. A lot of people like to put in nectar-rich bushes. So we're talking about banksias or bottlebrushes, things that, honey eaters like foraging on. If you want to put these back onto your property, make sure that you spread them out across the property. Don't put them all into one big clump. If you put them all together, that patch is just going to be dominated by aggressive honey eaters. So we're thinking about, red wattlebirds, New Holland honey eaters, noisy miners. It's really not the group of birds you're trying to attract back, or at least not in those numbers. And because they're that aggressive, they will exclude every other honey eater. So the best thing you can do is, if you have those species and you want to put them back, scatter them across the property a bit. So you can create, smaller groups of, 3 or 2, or, scatter them around with other bushes that are connected. So other birds like eastern spinebills that are far more shy and not aggressive at all, they still have the opportunity to use those nectar sources. So it's really key to make sure that you don't clump all those together, because you just get, I guess, red wattlebirds which will be hyper on sugar. Now, the third component of good woodland bird habitat is shrubs. And you might be thinking to yourself, didn't we cover this? It sort of falls onto structural diversity. It sort of falls into species diversity. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because shrubs are often absent from the landscape nowadays. Quite often this happened because we cleared all the shrubs to create grasslands for grazing. The other thing is that we left the shrubs standing, but livestock has, in the meantime, when they were grazing, has damaged the shrubs over time, and they've just sort of disappeared, and there's no seed bank anymore in the ground to bring them back. So it's one of the common things that is now missing from remnant woodland. And even if you're looking at remnant woodland just around the area, quite often you still see the trees standing there, but the shrub layer has just disappeared. So that's why I just wanted to highlight shrubs in this case. Of course, we're sort of going to cover the same thing again. So of course, shrubs are really good at providing food and nesting and roosting site for birds. Because as discussed, they have, they can produce flowers, or they can produce seeds that birds can use. Similar to coarse woody debris, because shrubs can be, 1 meter to 2 meters tall. The robins can use those to sit on and to scout out their food and see what's around. So they use them quite a bit for feeding. But really the biggest and most important function of shrubs in the woodland are protection. And this is protection from both predators, but also protection from aggressive bird species. So what's happened when we started, manipulating the landscape, and we took out a lot of the shrubs in the understory, we took out the mid-story, and quite often we took out most of the ground layer. We really just opened up the landscape and simplified it. So we now really have mostly landscapes with few trees, lots of grass, which means they're really open landscapes. And there's certain species that have just thrived in that. So we're talking about magpies, butcherbirds, and noisy miners. Now, all of those species are big and they're aggressive. So if you are a small bird, you absolutely stand no chance at the moment if you don't have a shrub near you. So what we need to do is we need to bring those shrubs back into the landscape so little birds have some shelter, and they can start using these woodlands again. Without those shrubs, they don't stand a chance. And this is species, like we're talking about chestnut-rumped heath-wren, speckled warblers. They're all really heavily reliant on shrubs, and you just won't find them in areas where there aren't any shrubs present. Now with shrubs and noisy miner, it's an interesting combination. So noisy miners, as you might know, they're highly aggressive species, and they chase out any other, bird species that comes into their territory. Noisy miners are now listed as a key threatening process under federal legislation, and that's specifically for woodland bird. So they have found that noisy miners have a significantly negative effect on small woodland birds. They're pretty much almost non-existent where noisy miners are. The reason why that is, noisy miners have exploded in numbers. As I said, we simplified the landscape. It's now a very open landscape, and this suits the noisy miner exceptionally well. So noisy miners like open landscapes because they like to have a clear line of sight across their territory. So they can see all the way to the edges of their territory, and they can see what birds are coming in. And the moment the bird enters, they're onto it. And because they're group living species, you get mobbed by, 8, 15 birds at a time. So if you're a small pardalote or you're a fairy wren, you cannot defend yourself against that. So the only option you have is to hide. So that's why shrubs are important. But funnily enough, shrubs have a different effect on noisy miners as well. It doesn't just protect their potential victim. It actually also discourages noisy miners. So as I said, noisy miners like that clear line of sight. The moment you start putting shrubs in and the vegetation becomes more dense, they lose that line of sight. And so all of a sudden they can't keep an eye on every part of their territory anymore. And if you put more shrubs in, that habitat becomes less and less suitable for the noisy miner itself. So with adding shrubs, you're increasing protection for the small woodland birds, but at the same time, you're making unsuitable habitat for the noisy miner. So the more shrubs you put in, eventually the noisy miners will start moving out, or at least decreasing to levels which are more natural levels, where they don't have that high effect on other birds. So that's really why I want to just stress that shrubs are exceptionally important for good woodland bird habitat, because they are one of the most important habitat features for the small woodland bird community. I'll just take a sip of water for a moment. Now, the fourth component that we'll talk about is connectivity. So habitat connectivity is really where you're creating linkages between existing patches of habitat. These habitats linkages can be created by creating windbreaks. There's roadside vegetation or riparian vegetation that creates long sort of snakes of vegetation. But there's also isolated paddock trees that birds can use to hop from one to the other as little stepping stones across the landscape. So that's really what we're thinking when we're talking about connectivity. It can be both corridors, or it can be the single stepping stones that you can create. Now, habitat connectivity is immensely important because we've got such a fragmented landscape at the moment, and a lot of those fragments are quite small. So there's only a finite amount of birds that can use it. There's a certain density that birds can live at. Once that goes over, the birds are just naturally pushed out. And if they're pushed out into an area which is unsuitable for them because it's just all open grassy woodland, all open grassland, they get really vulnerable for predation. So what really needs to happen is we need to give them a way out and a way to reach another suitable patch of vegetation. So that's where the linkages come in. One of the reasons that, the birds need to disperse is quite often when the juveniles, they get raised in the parents' territory. Then when the juveniles get old enough and they need to start finding their own mate, they need to start finding their own territory. That's when they get kicked out of the parental territory. And they need to find new habitat. So they need to use those linkages to go and find other suitable habitat. If those linkages aren't there, again, the bird will try to cross open woodland or open grassland. And sometimes that will work. And, they can happily find, thankfully, another area of woodland. But sometimes that open grassland is just too big. And by the time, they're halfway, they get spotted by, let's say, a brown goshawk. And that's unfortunately the end of the little bird that was trying to cross. So having that ability to disperse is immensely important. Also, it's really important for partner selection. So if you have a tiny little habitat and a tiny little patch, which contains, let's say, 5 pairs of scarlet robins, every time a juvenile matures and it doesn't have the opportunity to leave, it can only establish, another little territory in that existing patch, and it will start finding a mate that potentially is related to it, because there's only 4 pairs there. So there's only a finite combination of pairs that you can create, which means that quite often those areas of those small areas of habitat are very vulnerable to inbreeding. And so, there's a loss of genetic variation, there's inbreeding, and unfortunately, after a while, the population just starts dying out. So once again, they need to have that ability to move across. And then 2 other ones that are becoming more and more prevalent and that we are more and more aware of is climatic variations and climatic emergencies that are happening. So, for example, you live in a small area of woodland and drought settles into that area. All of a sudden, there's just not the food resources or the water resources for you anymore to survive. And for you to survive, you have to move to another area. And that, again, is where that connection is key and those corridors are key. And it's the same for, let's say, bushfire emergencies that are happening. So we've seen that, in recent years, bushfires have increased in intensity. So quite often, if bushfires are approaching, the birds are forced out of that area. Now, of course, they will try to cross, a cleared landscape. But if they can cross using a connection corridor or stepping stones, it's safer for them and their chances of survival are increased. So that's why we say connectivity across landscape is really important. So if you're looking at your own property, you can look at potentially connecting patches of existing vegetation within your own property, or you can look at connecting one of your patches to roadside vegetation, or maybe there's a riparian area in your property, a creek line, and quite often creek lines are still reasonably well vegetated. So that creates a really nice long vegetation corridor that birds can use for dispersal. So it's interesting to have a look at your landscape and maybe look at an aerial photo like the one shown here, where you can really see what habitat is left in your area and what your potential connections can be and what you can work on. Now, when we're talking about birds dispersing, of course, we're talking quite often about, smaller birds. So we're talking about fairy wrens, we're talking about, scrub wrens. They don't like, because they're so specialized in using shrubs and they need that to find protection from predators, they're not very comfortable crossing large areas of open space. So at the moment, they've always said 15 meters is the minimum distance or the maximum distance you can have between paddock trees or between like spaces between vegetation sites. Those 50 meters birds are willing to cross. If that distance increases and it becomes 60, it becomes 70 meters, there's fewer and fewer bird species that are willing to cross that distance or able to cross that distance. So while those stepping stones are still important, there's just fewer species that will be able to use it. So having them close together with a maximum distance of about 50 meters is ideal. And when we're talking about vegetation corridors, like any corridor is fantastic to at least get them started. But if you want birds to use that corridor as habitat in their own right, it has to be 30 meters wide. Otherwise, there's not enough resources for the birds within that corridor. And narrower corridors are far more vulnerable for noisy miner attack. Because again, if you have a narrow corridor, field of view is really good and noisy miners can use that habitat. If it's 30 meters wide, the view through that area is far more broken up, and it's far denser, and that's why noisy miners won't be able to use that area as much. So it's something to think about when we're talking about connectivity. And then the fifth one, which is waterways and dams, which sounds pretty straightforward, which it actually is. So one of the reasons waterways and dams are so important is they're a water source, very obviously, and birds require water for certain times of the year. There's been studies done that show that woodland birds breed more often in areas where there's water available in woodland areas than if in comparative areas that don't have water available. So they're more likely to breed when there's water available, and this is mostly because the birds require water. The nestlings all require insects for feeding, so the water often attracts a lot of insects as well. So it's really about location, location, location. Where can you put your nest? What's the most convenient? Around water is always best. So that's why we say, water is very important, but also it's a drought refuge for a lot of the birds. So when drought hits, the waterways and the dams are areas where, of course, water is longest retained. So the trees stay slightly healthier for a longer period. They still have the opportunities to flower or provide seed. So the birds can sort of hang around in those areas longer than in areas where there's no water and all the trees are dying because of the drought. So that's why we're saying if you have waterways on your property, if you have dams on your property, please fence them off and think about, restoring them, putting some trees back around them, and hopefully improving the health of that waterway and the dam. All right, so that sort of makes, those are the 5 top tips around creating woodland bird habitat. One of the questions we do often get is, do I need to plant specific plants for specific species? In general, the answer is no. Australian birds have grown up in an Australian landscape, and they've been well adapted to that Australian landscape. So a lot of the time, if you're just producing habitat that is structurally and species diverse, there's lots of food opportunities. Most of the birds, woodland birds, can use that, and you will attract a huge variety of birds to your property. Now, there are, of course, as usual, a couple of exceptions. So I've just listed 5 species here which are specific in their feeding requirements. So we've got southeastern red-tailed black cockatoo, which occurs on the South Australian Victorian border. They only feed on bull oak, brown, and desert stringybark. Glossy black cockatoos, they only feed on Allocasuarina or Casuarina species. And then the specific species depends a little bit in which region you are. The region honeyeater, which of course is a critically endangered species. One of the reasons is it's a bit picky with what it eats. So most of the time we're advising mugger ironbark, spotted gum, and yellowbox if you want to attract that back to the property. And then we've got, of course, our painted honeyeaters and mistletoe birds, which are both mistletoe specialists. So you'll have to have mistletoe on your property before those birds return to your property. So we can create a list for, if people can't follow this in time or write it down in time, we can always provide a list for you afterwards for the species-specific ones. But yeah, that's the 5 key things for creating good woodland bird habitat. And I guess the question is now, where to from here? So if you're in one of our areas, which for the Birds on Farms team, which are creating habitat restoration plans. So if you're in central west New South Wales around the Cowra area, or in southern New South Wales around Albury, maybe in the ACTS area or Yarra, which is just north of Melbourne, get in contact with one of our Birds on Farms teams, and they might be able to help develop a habitat restoration plan for you. If you're currently not in one of these areas, please be patient. We are creating an online learning system where people can follow the course and actually create their own habitat restoration plan themselves. So that will hopefully come out towards the end of the year. And of course, we'll let you know when that's available. But in the meantime, if you just want more information, you can find the Bird Friendly Farms Guide on our website. We also have developed a mistletoe propagation manual for Eastern Australia, which is available from the BirdLife website. But also you can just go and talk to your local land care group or maybe a native nursery and just talk about the species that they have available. Talk about your property and whether you're on a slope or whether you have a specific aspect to your property. You've got some, sorry, I've forgotten the name now. That you've got some specific soils, they can always help you out and say what species would be suitable for your area, and they can help you create this sort of diversity of species that you can plant. So it's definitely worth talking to them. For the mistletoe propagation manual, the Bird Friendly Farms Guide, as well as for the Nestbox website, we'll provide links to that in an email we'll send out after the presentation. So don't worry about trying to find those. And yeah, so that's it. That's the 5 key aspects for creating a woodland habitat. I hope in the end this sounds a little bit simpler, and it's a little bit less of a daunting, project to go ahead. Yeah, so it's remember those 5, and you'll do very well, and you'll attract lots of bird species to your property. So I guess that's it for me, and I'll give you back to Shannon. Sorry. Sorry,
That's okay. Margot's been my manager for a long time now. You think she'd get my name right? No, I'm joking. That was brilliant, Margot. And I found myself nodding along in agreement the whole way through. That was really great. Thank you. Now, the Birds on Farms team have been moderating the chat and answering a lot of questions, but I can see a couple there that we've not yet gotten to. So, Margot, do you have an opinion on which eucalypts you think are the quickest to produce useful hollows?
No, that really depends on where you live and in which area in Australia. So box gum boxes in general produce quite good hollows, and red gums as well. But it really depends on whether those are local to your area. So we always advise to definitely go local. There are some other ones, the species itself doesn't grow that big. So you won't really get big hollows out of those. So if we're talking about I'm based around Canberra, we have like brittle gums, which are smooth-barked species. They stay quite small because quite often they grow in rocky areas, and so they don't create really big hollows. So it's those red gums that are really good, because they grow really tall, and then once they break off limbs, that's when you get the really big hollows. But yeah, any species you plant, minimum is going to be 100 years before you get a hollow. So unfortunately, not in our lifetime.
Right, thank you. We've also had some of these questions have been answered, but if you'd like to add anything in addition to them, Margot, a bit of chat about non-native trees such as plane trees and mistletoe, and what mistletoe is going to work best and grow best. And just if you have any more thoughts around mistletoe in general, non-natives, what we can do.
Yeah, so mistletoe in general does have a few species. So we have almost 100 species of mistletoe in Australia. These species tend to be specialized in certain host species. So there's needle-leaf mistletoe, for example, which does really well on casuarinas and allocasuarinas. Also because the leaf of the mistletoe is shaped exactly like the leaf of the casuarina. So it really blends in. And there's one specific for gums, there's one specific for even grey box, stuff like that. So quite often it's best, of course, to use the species that you can find naturally on a host tree. But mistletoes are actually quite adaptive. So they have found in Melbourne where, Melbourne street trees are often plane trees. There's not much biodiversity that occurs in them because they're quite, I guess, monotonous. There's only plane trees. And to just increase the biodiversity and increase the birds that can use them, they've been planting mistletoe on that. And that's mistletoe is now taking, and it turns out, yes, Australian mistletoes can grow on plane trees. We do have one of the staff members from Birds on Farms who's planted one on his front yard on an introduced tree. And that one seems to have taken as well. So they seem quite adaptive to just grow on every tree. And they're quite easy to plant. You just need to actually find a mistletoe that's fruiting at the time and has fresh fruit that you can plant within 2 days of collecting it. But yeah, the principle's quite straightforward. But the strike rate of mistletoe, unfortunately, is quite low. So it's only about 10 to 20% of all the seeds that you plant that actually will become an adult mistletoe. But yeah, I love them. They do so much for biodiversity that we never realized.
And we had a great mistletoe talk. Was that last year? And is that up on our YouTube channel as well?
Yes, we do have that available, but there will also be one that's coming out around, I want to say, between August and October. We are trying to organize a mistletoe propagation workshop. So for people that want to know how to do the propagation on their property, we're organizing a workshop, and part of that workshop will be a webinar that will be published to everybody for Birds on Farms and beyond who's interested.
Brilliant. So we'll keep everyone updated on that. And yep. One more question. It's been touched on a little already, but blackberry does indeed provide protection for small birds from predators. But there are so many more useful native plants. Oh, sorry, hang on. That's not the question. That's Paul answering the question. Essentially, he's talking about blackberry and that it does provide useful habitat. So should we be pulling it out? Should we be keeping some blackberry? What are your thoughts on how we tackle this?
Well, of course, blackberry is an acknowledged pest species. It's a listed pest species in most of the states, so we do actually have to act upon it. I'm saying don't rip them all out at once. It's like a lot of other weeds. It's like if you have lantana further north, it's blackberries in the south. They are useful habitat, and if you have a large infestation, it's best to tackle them in stages. So first try and tackle the ones like the little outsiders that are not connected to the really big patch. Try to get rid of them first, and then plant some natives that have that same property. So there are some species out there which are, those prickly shrubs and small prickly acacias. Those are really good alternatives to the blackberries. And you just start working, and then you start working from the outside in. Quite a lot of the blackberries are really big infestations. So it's just, and it will take a few years. But we always say to try to tackle it as a staged approach, where you tackle the easy ones first, replace them, then you tackle the next ones, replace them, and do it. So there's always habitat for birds present. We've also had a landholder who's fenced some of his blackberry off because at the moment it provides erosion control for his gullies. And he's decided he's going to maintain it within the fence. So it won't spread, but it's the last part of his property he's going to tackle because he needs to find something else to stop the erosion from occurring in the creekline. There's several ways of approaching blackberry, but it's very good to keep it under some sort of control if you want to keep some of it standing there.
Great. Thank you, Margot. Maggie McDonald has said that that's such useful information, and thank you so much. And I really couldn't agree more. This has been a really interesting talk. I appreciate your time, and thank you. Yeah, thank you for being our guest speaker this evening.
That's all right. And
I'll see. Hang on. Do we have time for one more question? I think something's just popped up in the Q&A. Let me have a little look. Zoe Stanford has asked if there were no suitable hollows and wanted to look into using the nesting boxes, what would the process be to know dimensions of the relative species the box is for?
Yes. So we'll put this in the email as well. There's a fantastic website that's called Nest Box Tales. that has a lot of the design plans for particular nest boxes for particular species. So it will have all the dimensions, it will have the materials that you need, and you can build them yourself. That's the best asset that we have in Australia for doing, creating species-specific nest boxes. If you want to create them yourself, there's some other companies out there that are creating higher-end nest boxes, which are not created out of wood, but they're, for example, one of them is the Habitat company. They're creating them out of, and I want to say PVC. I'm not 100% sure, and Jaden might want to correct me on that. But they create nest boxes also specific for species, but they are a little bit more expensive, but they last a lot longer as well. So wooden nest boxes quite often only last maybe 5 years before you need to start fixing them. These Habitat nest boxes can last you a decade or longer, and they are also better temperature controlled than wooden nest boxes are. So wooden nest boxes quite often get too warm during the day. And the Habitat boxes, because they're more insulated, they provide a more constant temperature for the birds and for the eggs to develop. And they have different boxes for different species as well. So that's something else to look into. But we'll definitely provide the website details for the Habitat tail or for the nest box tails.
And in addition to that, Jennifer has asked, is it necessary to have cameras to monitor the nest boxes?
No, it's not. It is, however, essential to monitor your nest box. So it's enough to come and do the occasional visit to see if there's birds that are flying around the area. Because it's really important to figure out who's using the nest box. If it's bees, you need to get them treated, either, get them to an apiarist or somebody to remove them. If it's, for example, starlings that have taken up the nest box, if you're early enough, you can take the nesting material away. And if you keep doing that, you discourage the starlings from nesting there. And it's still available for, the species that you want. And the other reason to monitor it as well is quite often once they're done with breeding, there's quite a lot of nest parasites that are left over in the nest box. So it's a really good thing to just give it a quick clean and make sure, it's hygienic again for the next species to use. And also you want to just keep in mind and keep an eye on it to see that it doesn't fall apart. And, sometimes little door falls off or the little stick in front of it where birds sit on sometimes will fall off. So it's just good to make sure that it's all still in working order. But yeah, cameras, I mean, they're fantastic because it's fantastic to watch the birds go in and out, see how often they feed, who's feeding, whether it's a male, whether it's a female. So, from a point of view of just interest, nest boxes are fantastic. Plus, having a camera removes your presence, so you don't have to be present the whole time. But yeah, just walking past every once in a while and just checking who's using the nest box doesn't do any harm.
Great. And for anyone who's interested, Jaden has put some nest box website links in the chat there as well. Now, I think that's pretty much all that we have time for. We've just hit the that hour mark. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us, and we look forward to having you join us for our next Your Birds on Farms webinar. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you. And thanks, Margot.
No worries. Thank you all. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shannon, for hosting us.
Cheers.